All right. Good morning, everybody. Ted Feeney with IQE. Appreciate your time, and know you have 1,000 other things to do at your school, but really appreciate joining us this morning. Just wanted to take a little bit and recap the legislative session. It is over. It was a crazy 9 weeks. Luckily we still have Molly, so we all powered through. But just wanted to kind of go through and do a little bit deep dive on what happened, all the work sort of behind the scenes to keep the good stuff going and stop the bad stuff. And then at the end, obviously, have time for questions or throughout whatever's easiest, and then talk a little bit about next year. So, Molly, I guess I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ted, and thanks everyone for joining. Feel free to go to the first slide. So just a quick recap. So the legislative session, so it started beginning of January, and then officially ended last Friday, a week from today. So it was actually supposed to end, or by law, it had to end as of yesterday. So they ended about a week early. I think everyone was ready to leave, ready to get out of it. There's always new regulations, unfortunately, that comes out of these legislative sessions, but the shorter the time frame, definitely did make it harder for them to get some of these regulations passed. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. But we will walk through the bills that ultimately, the amount of bills that were filed versus those that were passed. And these numbers, I look back at last year, even though last year was a longer session, these numbers actually aren't too far off in terms of the percentages. So there's 739 total bills that were filed in both the House and the Senate, and 172 passed, made it on to the governor. I think there's a couple he still has to sign, but they at least passed the General Assembly. And I believe all education bills, with the exception of one, have been signed by the governor. And so 23% passed into law. So there's a lot of bills that start off in the beginning, and then as they go through the legislative process, they die, which a lot of times is a good thing. That means less burdens on schools, less that everyone has to implement. But then, so looking at specifically the education focused bills, so there were 75 total that were filed and 19 passed. So 19 doesn't sound like a lot of bills. But when we start getting into these slides, you'll see there's still a lot within each bill. What happens, even though they have less time to pass bills, less committee hearings, they end up pushing a lot of bills into giant bills that have 75 pages or more. So it's kind of an interesting time. The legislature can always find a way to get around these short time frames. So those are the quick little highlights. Ted, feel free to go to the next slide. So we're just going to walk through real quick a couple of things that actually don't impact you guys. Some of these you might have seen in headlines. So I just want to highlight a couple of them that do not have, they're not new regulations on private schools. They are only on public schools. And then walk through legislation that actually does impact you guys. And then talk about going forward, talk about the next legislative session just real quick. Next slide. So the first couple bills, and these ones, especially the first one, I know there's been a lot of articles in the news about it. So I just wanted to highlight these real quick before we kind of dive into the nitty gritty. So student use of wireless communication devices. This is only for public schools, and they have to come up with a policy prohibiting students from using cell phones. There, along with a few other items like gaming devices and laptops. There are some exceptions to it, but this does not apply to you guys. You're always welcome to do these things, but they do not apply to you. Senate Enrolled Act 282. There is a big look this year on truancy, absenteeism, everything that comes along with it. And so I just want to look at that first provision in this bill, which requires public schools to establish a truancy and prevention policy for students in K through 6. So once again, that's only for public schools. I'm sure a lot of you might have already policies anyways, but that is specifically focused on public schools. There's some more in this bill, and you'll notice on a lot of these slides, I'm not going to hit every single point in the bill, every single provision, because we will be here all day if I do that. There is a lot that has passed, unfortunately. So on to the next slide. So this is one final one I want to mention that does not impact non-public schools. This is only a public school thing, so specific for school safety. So the first provision, really, it just requires a school safety plan the public school has to develop regarding armed intruder drill protocol. And then there's a lot of other little pieces that go along with it. But once again, this does not impact non-public schools. Next slide. Okay, so now looking at bills that actually do apply to non-public schools. So robotics competition 1233. There's actually a provision in here that IQE specifically put in to help non-public schools. So in 2023, under House Enrolled Act 1382, they created this robotics competition program grant. And we'll send this out to you guys too so that you'll have it. So there's a link in here to the competition grant if you're not already familiar with it. And so when they drafted the original bill last year, they accidentally excluded third-party accredited non-public schools. That was not the intention, but that's unfortunately what happened. So we were able to just clean that up so that all accredited non-public schools are now able to participate, whether it's state accredited or third party accredited. And then there's a couple other provisions that went along that are necessarily, they're not specific to non-public schools, but they definitely apply to you. They apply to all school types. So the current law allows the expenses for this grant to be associated with attendance at a robotics competition. And that's another item that they just cleaned up from the original bill so that it's really any expenses associated at a robotics competition. So kind of a small change, but still incredibly important. And then they expanded it as well to community-based robotics competition teams. And a couple other pieces in there, but those are the top ones I wanted to highlight for you guys. On to the next slide. So 1380, this is one of those big bills that they start putting a variety of provisions in. So I have multiple slides on this one, but a couple things that are specific to the non-public schools. So in 2023, there was a law that aligned the voucher birth date deadline with the traditional public schools or all public schools. So it aligned everything to October 1. However, it didn't align the ESA and the tax credit scholarship birth dates. So that was kind of a cleanup to make sure everything's aligned, everything's efficient. There's not confusion for parents, for schools. So both the ESA and the SGO now have an October 1 birth date deadline as opposed to the August one. And then I would just note for the SGO or tax credit scholarship, we also expanded it last year to include 4-year-olds. So that you have to be 4 for that one, but everything else is 5. So voucher, ESA, all public schools, that's all 5. Another item specific to you guys, and it may not apply to every single non-public school. This one is looking at feeder schools specifically. There is a very convoluted statute currently that walks through transferring from, public to public transferring from a non-public to a traditional public. It's very convoluted. So we cleaned up one provision in it. The whole thing really needs an overhaul. But there was a provision in there that we removed that just required a majority of students, so 51%, that are the same grade level as a specific transferring student at their non-public school or feeder school. That majority of these students in that grade had to have legal settlement in the school district. So very specific, very convoluted. Makes me wonder who they're trying to keep out. So that is something that we just struck that whole language. Now, there's still other smaller things in there regarding the transfer situation, but that specific one was removed to ensure that feeder schools aren't having an issue with, if you don't have a high school and you're sending, you have a lot of students that are transferring to the local public school, that's a little bit easier for everyone. A couple other things that are not specific to non-public schools, but are important to be aware of. If you remember the Indiana Student Enrichment Grant Program, or Indiana Learns, it's what it's more commonly called. Some people also call it the micro grant, so it's got a lot of names. But Indiana Learns is the true name that it goes by. They extended that so that it no longer expires. It was set to expire this fall, so they removed that expiration and then removed a few other statutes regarding federal funds, ESSER funds, to ensure the longevity of this program, and that we can really ensure that students are getting the intervention and support that they need. And then this one, we'll see where this ends up. The Secretary of Education, she's required to create a report for the General Assembly, creating a pilot program for innovative approaches looking at buildings as well as transportation. So getting students to and from school, as well as specific, not everyone has easy access to buildings, as I'm sure a lot of you are well aware. So looking at really how can we redo that? How can we reevaluate that as a state so that every student can get to the school of their choice? So we'll see where that ends up. I mean, it's not technically calling for an actual action, just a report. So I'll be very curious to see what the department comes up with. I'm sure we will have some conversations with them. On to the next slide. So more in 1380, there's a lot of provisions in this bill. So I'm not going to walk through every single one on here, but once again, we'll be sharing this PowerPoint so everyone will be able to have it and walk through. I'll hit on just a couple. So the Student Learning Recovery Grant Program, this passed in 2021. And it just kind of similar to the Indiana Learns program that we just talked about. It's extending it, so it's getting rid of that expiration of the program so that we can continue to help students. And then it's also, I mean, it repeals a couple of different things, but mostly just wanted to highlight that it's subject to available funding. So this was not a budget year, so they can't necessarily allocate funds to it this year, but next year will be a budget year. So we will see what occurs with that program. It seems like that program and the other one I mentioned and both had a lot of success. I'm looking forward to hopefully having more funds in there. Another one, this is a new regulation on all school types, and it's just looking at National Guard or reserve components. And so for the non-public schools, requiring that you guys are authorizing the absent and excuse of each secondary school student that's not a habitually truant student and is ordered to active duty in the armed forces. And so it's specific to at least 15 days in a school year. So it's extending it. I'm trying to remember what it is right now, if it's 10 or 12, but it's extending it to 15, just a little bit longer. And I believe that came from, it just aligned with some of the boot camps and other things that the National Guard have. Without this, they would have to go AWOL from the National Guard. So there were some issues that were happening. So those are some of the highlights. On to the next one. So this is one I'm sure you guys have all heard about. This is Senate Enrolled Act 1. A lot of people have referred to it as the retention bill. There's a lot of pieces to this bill. So I'll try to highlight as much as I can. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions or thoughts about this bill going forward. On all these, I should say the Department of Education, I spoke with them yesterday and asked them when I could expect guidance on these bills, they did not know yet. So they are still trying to wrap their head around every single thing that has occurred. But they did say in the next several weeks they would put out official guidance for schools. Usually you can find that in their weekly newsletter. So I would look for it in the next couple of weeks as they really dive through every single bill and figure out what information they need to give you guys. So Senate Enrolled Act 1, the first piece of it is kind of the screening, identification, and then intervention for these students. So this is before we even get to any retention possibility. So we've been moving not only in Indiana, but as a nation more towards that science of reading requirements. So there, once again, there was a lot of things passed last year related to it, but they're requiring schools to provide reading instruction that's aligned with science of reading for K through 8. Elementary schools will have to be doing a universal screener for K through 2. And then if there are interventions needed, they're able to then, you guys can identify at that point, at least that's the thought behind it. DOE, they are required under this bill to find a preferred vendor for the screener. And then they are going to be required to work with schools that are below that 70% of proficiency on iRead. And this is like those that are above that 70%, they're not required to utilize one of these vendors, but they are encouraged. And then DOE will provide guidance on the number of times the screener is going to be required, when it should be administered. So more to come, a lot on that provision, really on all these. It is requiring elementary schools to administer iRead to second grade students. But it looks like, and I can't speak for every single one of your schools on here, but a majority of elementary schools have already opted into this. So before it even became a requirement in law, it looks like a majority of elementary schools have opted into doing that for the next school year. And then the state board. So this one, although it says it's not very clear in the bill how it's written. I talked to DOE, and I believe this is intended specific to virtual schools, but I did just want to mention it. The state board is required to establish a method for virtual administration of iLearn. This could potentially apply to iRead someday. It could apply to non-virtual schools someday, but at this time, they're looking at iLearn and looking at virtual schools specifically. And kind of, I think how it pans out will determine if it's expanded further. And then it also requires students and parents to get really specific information that's easy for them to understand from the vendor regarding their students' iRead results. And so schools will then be required to notify the parents of these results, of potential intervention or any action they need to take to help the students become proficient. And then there's going to be a survey as well coming from DOE regarding what schools are doing, what kind of funding is associated with it, so they can really gather more information of what's needed and how they can provide support to you guys. So that's a lot. We are not done yet. So on to the next slide. There's more in this bill. So summer school is the next provision of this, or the next piece, I should say. So beginning in the next school year, schools, and once again, this is all school types, they are required to offer summer school courses for students who are not reading proficient or at risk of not being reading proficient. Schools can partner together. I know this may be a challenge for a lot of you guys, but you are able to partner with multiple schools, no matter the school type, to kind of provide one summer school program or course. Hopefully that will help a little bit. And then they did expand the eligibility for funding for summer school to now include non-public schools. This will, there's only so much funding out there. And I believe they'll have to come back and do that in the next budget year. But non-public schools will be eligible for this when the time comes. And then summer school does have to be taught by someone trained in the science of reading. So back to the science of reading. And then, so although a student isn't necessarily required to participate in summer school, if they do decide to participate and they don't achieve a 90% attendance rate in summer school, then they are going to be required to participate in an individual reading plan for the following school year. Okay, I think there's one more slide on this bill, and then we can move on to some other ones. So the last couple pieces, so the big one that's been in all the headlines is the retention piece of this bill. And so keep in mind, there's a lot that happens before we even get to the retention, but this is starting this school year. So it will take effect right away. So beginning in the school year for when iRead is administered in this, in the following, for this, I guess, 2025 spring, it requires retention of students in grade 3, in addition to any remediation if that student has not received a passing score on iRead after 3 attempts. So they're going to have that second grade option that they're taking iRead. They're going to have summer school if they choose to take summer school, and then that third grade. So potentially, I guess, 2 or 3 attempts to take iRead. And if they're not passing it, that's when they're going to be retained. There are some exemptions. So if they were already retained in the year prior, or if they meet a good cause exemption. So a lot of these you might be familiar with. They're in rule already, so they just moved a lot, not all, but they moved a lot of them over to code. So a good cause exemption, if the student has a disability or their IEP specifies that retention is not appropriate in this case, if they're an English language learner and they've received services for fewer than 2 years, and a committee has determined that promotion to 4th grade is appropriate for that student. If they are proficient in math, according to iLearn, or if they are retained twice in kindergarten through 2nd grade and have already received intensive intervention for 2 or more years. So there, I imagine, is going to be a lot of guidance coming out related to this. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, exactly how everything will fit in, what this means for everyone. So as soon as we are aware of guidance, we are happy to share with everyone, but feel free to keep looking at DOE's newsletter that comes out weekly. If you don't know, if you're not already looking at that, reach out to Ted, and we will make sure you guys have the link to that or can subscribe to that. And so then a couple other things on retention. So schools must establish a procedure allowing a parent of a student to appeal that student's retention if they believe they should have received a good cause exemption. And then DOE is then required also to notify the parent if a child who's been enrolled in kindergarten of the retention requirements of the state, so that they will be aware ahead of time before they get to that situation. Hopefully they won't. And then the final piece of Senate Bill 1, I know this has been a lot, is continued monitoring. So schools, they're asking that you're continuing to monitor the progress of students who are not passing iRead, and that these students will take iRead even if they have a good cause exemption until they receive a passing score or until they hit 7th grade. So they're trying to ensure they have the data on what's happening with these students if they're moving forward. And then lastly, it's requiring school reporting on interventions of students at risk of not being proficient by the end of 3rd grade, and for students who are not achieving a passing score on iRead. So there's a lot on that one. Once again, this is something that is looking at all school types. There's a lot to digest. I'm sure some of these things might not be new for you guys. Some of them are brand new, and there's a lot that's going to have to be considered on how to implement. And any way we can help, feel free to reach out to myself, to Ted, and then once again, we'll keep an eye out for that guidance. On to the next slide. I know that one was a big one. Oh, I forgot. There's one slide. That's how big this bill is. One more slide. And this is just looking at the instructional coach or literacy coaches. And so I won't hit on everything on here because I do want to start getting to some of the next bills. But I would definitely encourage you to come back and look at this one. And on to the next slide. Couple other things. Literacy was clearly a big theme this year. So Senate Enrolled Act 6 is kind of the companion bill to the bill we just went over. It's a lot smaller though. It's essentially doing two things. So it's requiring DOE to develop a method and guidance for schools to identify students in grade 4 through 8 who have not passed iRead and are at risk of not being proficient in reading. And then it's also asking DOE or requiring DOE to put out information on how to support these students so that they know how to best help you guys. And then Senate Enrolled Act 212, there's just one piece in there on literacy, but just I wanted you to be aware of it. It's prohibiting a teacher prep program from using any curriculum that's based on 3Qing. So once again, they're looking at the science of reading instead. That's what they want to be the focus going forward. So they're applying it not just in the K through 12 space, but they're looking beyond that as well in the teacher prep programs. Now some things not related to literacy in this bill. And we actually mentioned this in 1380. So these last two bullet points on here were in 1380, so I will not hit on them again. That's just something, sometimes they move bills in both the House and Senate that are the exact same. Usually they clean it up and they remove things, but this is the exact same language that was in 1380, so nothing new there. On to the next slide. 1243. This is another very big bill. I have maybe 5 or more slides on this one, so I won't hit every single piece. This was a bill that I believe they ended up putting 3 or maybe 4 bills into it combined. What happened, there was actually another very large Various Ed Matters bill that was going to die based on one provision. And so they took all the other provisions that were not going to die, that had no issues, and put them into this bill. So it's already a big bill. Then they took another big bill, combined them, and put a couple other provisions in from other bills. So it is quite a monster of a bill, but I will try to hit the highlights. It's incredibly important. As you can see, it's looking at diploma requirements, or as they keep saying across the state, I'm sure you've seen this in news articles, rethinking high school. So that is the focus going forward, rethinking, reevaluating, even reimagining high school is what I keep hearing. So State Board of Education will establish a new standard Indiana diploma. And this is looking at students graduating in the 2029 cohort. There's already been some state board meetings on this, but it's officially in code now in this bill. And so specifically, State Board has to establish diploma designations, stating that a student is adequately prepared in either one or both of these. So direct entry into the workforce upon graduation, and then or post-secondary education aligned to the student's chosen career path. And then there's a few more things. All these bullet points beneath it are exactly what else State Board needs to consider when looking or creating this diploma. So I'm not going to walk through every single piece, but I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. And then just a reminder that current law already has required State Board to adopt rules regarding the new diploma as of December this year. So more to come on that front. And I know this will be a big change. And then on to the next slide. So more on this bill. These are some other pieces kind of related to diploma or some requirements. So State Board is now, it's a may, not a shall, but they may allow a computer science course to satisfy one or more diploma course requirements. So it's a may, it's not a requirement, but I believe it's likely they will allow this. And then looking at the cohort of students for 2029 or graduating in 2029, they must complete instruction on computer science as a separate subject before they graduate. So that is a new requirement on all schools. And then there's also another one I wanted to highlight, this bottom bullet point. So this is extending a current requirement that was only in high school, extending it down to 8th grade. So all schools now have to include in their curriculum for 8th grade all the way up to 12th grade instruction on personal financial responsibility. So it's just extending that further. On to the next slide. There's more. So let me think about the ones I want to highlight. There's a lot here. I want to talk more, I guess, about the redesigning iLearn, because that's going to be critical. You might have been hearing about that already. But 1243, so this bill is creating through year assessments or checkpoints for iLearn essentially. So they'll have kind of small checkpoints throughout the year. And then at the end, there's going to be a final summative assessment at the end of the year. I believe that is going to be shorter than it currently is. At least that's the intention. And that's what DOE keeps saying. That's what State Board is saying. But this will be a change. And the goal of that for these checkpoints is that so you can kind of see through the year where these students are, so that by the time they get to that final summative assessment, that they are better prepared. We will see what happens. This is another one that's going to need a lot of guidance. And then schools already can pilot the iLearn checkpoints. Or can opt into this pilot. You guys can already do that, but it's for the 2024-2025 school year. So that's one more to come, but I wanted to highlight that's going to change quite a bit for everyone. And then math policy, although it hasn't been as big as literacy this year, there were some provisions related to math. Not necessarily, I mean, I guess there's some new requirements. A lot of more on DOE. Actually, I think it might all be on DOE. So I'm not going to walk through every single one of these, but know that math is starting to get a larger focus as well. Literacy has obviously been a huge focus. So I would expect more legislation next year on math. But right now, at least these two provisions are specific to DOE and the information that they're putting out for schools. On to the next slide. There's more math here, but this is also a DOE requirement as well. And then I think we will move on to the next slide. I don't want to walk through everything. I don't want to keep you guys longer than you have to be here. See, this bill is incredibly large. I guess one thing I'll highlight is that the bill provides a successful completion of IB, of an IB diploma program course shall count for high school credit. So that is new this year. It requires schools, so including non-public schools, to have a policy regarding the participation of habitually truant students in extracurricular activities. So it's just saying that you guys have to create a policy. It's not necessarily saying what that policy has to be, but it's asking that a policy is created. And that's going back to the big discussion there's been on truancy, on absenteeism. It's definitely getting a larger focus. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more legislation next year looking at truancy and absenteeism. And that one of the first bills we mentioned was 282, which did not apply to you guys. And that is something we had to work really hard to get non-public schools so that it wouldn't apply to you guys. So that was a tough one to pull non-public schools out, but that's something we'll keep trying to do, not just on that, but on all these bills. On to the next slide. So 1001, there's a couple pieces in here for you guys I want to highlight. So if you're familiar with career scholarship accounts or CSAs, and then education scholarship accounts or ESAs, which sound very similar. So the ESA program, they expanded that. So right now is only for special needs students. And just a reminder, that is for tuition and fees at a non-public school. If you have dollars left over, you can use it for tutoring, transportation. Students can also educate at home if they want. So there's a lot of different uses for it. So they expanded that beyond the special needs families or students to the sibling of that student as well. There are some requirements on exactly what they can purchase because a lot of the current law is stating that the student's IEP, if it requires them to have occupational therapy or any other things that the special needs student might have, it all goes back to that IEP. So they didn't think it made sense for a sibling of that student that doesn't have an IEP to be accessing things that wouldn't necessarily apply to them in this case. At least that was the intention behind it. And then it also expanded that ESA program to you can now use the funds on curricular materials. Then looking at the CSA program, there are a couple different things that were done in there. And I guess the main thing is that you can now use CSA funds for costs related to a driver's license. There are some specific requirements in there. You can see, I know it's kind of small print. And CSA funds can be used in general for transportation costs. But there's once again other requirements in there. So you can't use the CSA, the Career Scholarship Account. You can't use it to buy a vehicle or anything like that. But to get to your work-based learning opportunity, your internship, your apprenticeship, you can use the funds for transportation or to obtain a driver's license to get you to these things. And then another thing that was added in, so originally parents only had 7 days from when the Treasurer of State approved their application to create an account to essentially start using it. And so now they have 30 days, so a little bit more time because that was just not easy for schools, for parents, for anyone to use. So those are some of the highlights, and we will move on to the next slide. And I know this is a lot, so I will try to hurry up for you guys. So Senate Enrolled Act 8, I really just wanted to highlight one key piece in here. A lot of it isn't necessarily a direct application to you guys, but I wanted you to just be aware of what's going on the higher ed front in regard to this bill. But the main one I wanted to highlight was they're looking at Indiana College Core. And so it's requiring each high school to begin this coming school year to do a couple different things. So they can either just offer Indiana College Core, or they can, if it's not something they can offer this coming school year, the school can offer to the Commission on Higher Education an implementation plan for the following school year. If you can't do it by that school year, you're able to do an implementation plan for the school year after that. But finally, if it's not something that makes sense for your school, if it's not feasible, if your school, maybe you're more focused on career readiness, like CTE specifically, then you would do a feasibility report. Or maybe your school is too small that it's going to be incredibly burdensome to offer the Indiana College Core. So you would do this feasibility report instead, and that will be required to be submitted by October 1st of this year to the Commission for Higher Education. And you would just explain why it's not feasible. There is nothing in here at this time that requires a school to actually offer Indiana College Core. So if it's not something that makes sense, you do the feasibility report. Now, that doesn't mean in the future they can't try to do a bill that would require it. And that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. But this is one I work directly with DOE, Commission for Higher Education, to walk them back. The original bill just flat out applied Indiana College Core to everyone, which there's a lot of pieces that go along with that and may not make sense for every school. So we're able to get them back on that one. So that's the highlight of Senate Enrolled Act 8. There's a lot more on here as well, but that's the main one I wanted to make you aware of. On to the next slide. Okay, 211. So I'm not going to walk through this one just because it's a lot smaller, and for the sake of time, I want to make sure we get to questions. So on to the next slide. 1042. So this is, if you remember last year, some of you might remember they passed a transition to teaching scholarship. They put some clarifications in there. This actually took off and was very successful. There are a lot of people using this transition to teaching scholarship. So it's really exciting to see. I know teachers are something that it's incredibly hard to find right now. There's an issue, I mean, not just in Indiana, but it walks through some of the requirements in here. I won't go through every single piece, but the main thing I do want to highlight is that, so for this scholarship, so any balance in the Next Generation Hoosier Educator Scholarship Fund that is remaining, that money can then instead go into the teacher scholarship. So there could potentially be more funding for this. It's very successful. I believe they've been utilizing all the money they've received. And so this is something that's trying to get more funds in there so people can access it and become teachers. On to the next slide. And this is one I just wanted you to be aware of. There's a lot of headlines on it. So I'm not going to walk through all of it. It's pretty straightforward there, but it was big in the news. So I just wanted to make you all aware of it. There's no new requirements in it though for you guys. So that's mostly why I put it on here. It's just a general kind of statement the General Assembly is making, but there's nothing that impacts you guys. But I wanted you to be aware of it because there's been a lot of discussions. The bill is not the exact same version that made the original headlines when it came out. It was watered down a bit. But I think that might be the last bill. On to the next slide. Yes. So once we send out this PowerPoint to everyone, you can also click on this link, and this will show you all the bills that I just highlighted, and you'll be able to go and read through every single bill in there in detail, see exactly what the law truly says. And on to the next slide. Ted, did you want to hit on this one, or?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Molly. And just can't thank you and Betsy enough for all of your tireless work at the State House, for all the, especially work for non-public schools. It means a lot. And I think there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes with a lot of bills of, taking out, excess provisions that don't need to apply to non-public schools. So there's a lot of that, especially in, happened this past session a lot. But did want to say a couple things just as we sort of move toward next session 2025. I know we just finished, but we at IQE convened a number of state and national stakeholders, SGO administrators, school leaders, school staff, to talk through non-public school potential legislation and what's coming down the road, things that need to happen. We've had a core group for a number of years. Some of you on the call are regulars with that. Happy to, if you want to get more involved in the political process and legislative side of it, please let us know. Happy to have you join that. Also, we have a number of outreach staff. So if you need, like Mary, Julie, myself, Eli, Taki, Sarah, Caesar, to come out, talk to your school in any capacity, host a parent information session, help with enrollment over the next year, please let us know. Still a number of months left in this school year, as well as into the fall, or even activities in the summer, whatever makes sense. So just wanted to get that in, and a couple things to think about.
And I just want to add, so looking at 2025, that's a budget year, as I mentioned. So that's when we can actually do things that have a fiscal impact. So a key thing we're going to be looking at next year, or I'd say one of the top things, will be the full expansion of vouchers. So a universal voucher program. We're pretty close to it now. The last budget session, the estimate was that we were $11 million annually away from universal. Why they couldn't have just done it last session is a great question. But that will be our top goal next year, is to get universal vouchers. That's obviously a long way away, but I know there's a lot of legislators that share that sentiment, and we're not the only state moving towards universal choice. There's a lot that already have it. So we're almost there. All right, well, that's all I have. So thank you everyone for joining, and sorry that was really long-winded, but enjoy the rest of your Friday.